After God delivered the Israelites from Egypt, He gave Moses detailed instructions at Mount Sinai. These instructions included specific laws for offerings, sacrifices to be brought to the Lord at the tabernacle. Each type of offering had clear requirements, specific times, and purposes, as God commanded. These sacrifices were not random. They were to be offered according to His exact instructions, and each came with instructions for the priests who would perform them. 1. Burnt offering. The burnt offering was offered whenever a person wanted to present themselves to the Lord. It could be brought from the herd or the flock, depending on the wealth and ability of the person offering it. If the person was wealthy, they could bring a male bull without defect. If less wealthy, a male sheep or goat without defect was acceptable. If they could not afford a larger animal, they could bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. The person bringing the offering was required to lay their hand on the animal's head before it was killed. The priest would then slay the animal before the Lord at the entrance of the tabernacle. The fat, kidneys, and liver lobe were burned on the altar, and the rest of the animal was completely consumed by fire. This offering could be brought at any time of devotion or in response to a vow, as God commanded. 2. Grain offering. The grain offering was offered as a gift of tribute or thanksgiving to the Lord. God instructed that it consist of fine flour mixed with oil and sometimes frankincense. A portion of the grain offering, along with all its frankincense, was to be burned on the altar as a memorial portion to the Lord, while the rest was given to the priests to eat. No yeast or honey was allowed, and the grain had to be pure and finely ground. The offering could be brought daily when a person completed a vow or as a freewill offering. The priests handled the preparation carefully. They would pour oil on it, sprinkle it with incense, and present it on the altar. God commanded that these offerings be without omission or substitution, specifying how much was to be burned and how much was given to the priests. 3. Fellowship or peace offering. The fellowship offering, also called the peace offering, was offered to express gratitude or celebrate fellowship with the Lord. It could be brought from the herd or flock, male or female, and it had to be without defect. God specified. A portion of the fat and blood was to be burned on the altar as a food offering to the Lord. The priest received a portion, and the rest could be shared by the worshippers as part of a meal. These offerings were also made as a vow, as a freewill offering, or in gratitude for blessings. God instructed that the fat, kidneys, liver lobe, and the fatty tail must not be eaten by anyone outside of these rules. 4. Sin offering. Sin offerings were offered for unintentional sins, and the required animal depended on who sinned. If a priest sinned, he was to bring a young bull without defect, lay his hand on its head, and slay it at the entrance of the tabernacle. The blood was sprinkled before the veil of the sanctuary, and the fat burned on the altar. If the whole community sinned, the leader brought a young bull, and the blood was sprinkled on the altar and before the Lord, atoning for all Israel. If a leader sinned personally, a male goat without defect was required. If an ordinary person sinned unintentionally, a female goat or lamb, or even 2 turtle doves/pigeons, could be offered, depending on their ability. The sinner would lay hands on the animal, transferring responsibility symbolically. The priest then slayed the animal and performed the prescribed ritual, including burning the fat and specific parts on the altar. These offerings were required whenever sin was recognized, demonstrating God's detailed instructions for unintentional wrongdoing. 5. Guilt offering. Guilt offerings were offered when someone sinned against God or another person, especially when dishonesty or theft occurred. The sinner was required to make restitution plus 1/5 additional value to the person wronged. Then they brought a female lamb or goat without defect to the priest, who performed the offering. God specified that this offering was required to cover unintentional sins that required restitution, including breaking trust or misusing sacred property. The blood and fat were handled according to God's instructions, and the remainder of the animal was burned or given to the priest as specified. 6. Instructions for the priests. God gave very specific instructions to the priests for handling all offerings. Some parts were to be burned entirely, some given to the priests, and some shared with the people according to the rules. Priests were not allowed to eat portions that were not designated for them, and some offerings had to be burned outside the camp. The priests were also to keep a fire continually burning on the altar and ensure offerings were presented correctly, without omission. These instructions applied to every type of offering: burnt, grain, fellowship, sin, or guilt, and ensured worship was holy, proper, and according to God's command. God emphasized that obedience to these rituals was essential, as they guided both priests and worshipers in maintaining holiness and proper relationship with Him. Through these detailed instructions, God showed His people how to approach Him in worship. Each offering had a specific time, type of animal or grain, and method of presentation, whether it was for devotion, thanksgiving, fellowship, sin, or restitution. Every sacrifice, whether a bull, a lamb, a dove, or a handful of flour, was governed by God's precise law. The Israelites learned that worship required obedience, attention to detail, and faithfulness to God's commands. These laws preserved holiness among the people and ensured that every act of devotion was performed according to the Lord's will. After the ordination of Aaron and his sons, the priests began their sacred ministry in the tabernacle. Everything was done according to God's instructions. The sacrifices, the offerings, and the rituals were performed with deep reverence. The glory of the Lord appeared before all the people, and fire came out from His presence, consuming the burnt offering on the altar. The people fell face down in awe and worship. But soon after this holy moment, tragedy struck. Nadab and Abihu, the two oldest sons of Aaron, took their censers, the small pans used to carry burning incense, and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord. This means they burned incense in a way God had not commanded. Perhaps they were carried away by excitement, curiosity, or pride. Whatever their reason, they acted carelessly in the presence of the holy God. Without warning, fire came out from the Lord's presence and consumed them. In an instant, the same fire that once showed God's glory now became a fire of judgment. Nadab and Abihu died there, before the Lord. Moses told Aaron, "This is what the Lord spoke of when He said, 'Among those who approach me, I will be proved holy. In the sight of all the people, I will be honored.'" Aaron stood in silent grief. Though his heart was heavy, he did not speak against God's decision. The remaining sons, Eleazar and Ithamar, were told not to leave their duties or mourn publicly, for the anointing oil of the Lord was upon them. From that day, it became clear that serving God required obedience, not innovation. God is holy, and His instructions must be followed carefully, not out of fear, but out of deep respect for His presence. The story of Nadab and Abihu stands as a solemn reminder. Reverence and obedience are vital when serving the Lord. After the sacred events of the priestly ordination, the Lord spoke again to Moses and Aaron, giving them detailed instructions about what the Israelites could and could not eat. These commands were not just about diet, they were about holiness, reminding God's people that every part of their lives, even their meals, should reflect obedience to Him. The Lord said, "Speak to the Israelites and tell them, 'These are the animals you may eat among all the beasts of the earth.'" They could eat animals that had a split hoof completely divided and that chew the cud, like cattle, sheep, and goats. But others, such as the camel, the rabbit, and the pig, were forbidden because they did not meet both requirements. In the waters, only those that had fins and scales could be eaten. Everything else, like shellfish, was unclean. Among the birds, God listed many that were forbidden: eagles, vultures, owls, and bats. These were often scavengers or birds of prey, creatures associated with death and impurity. Even among insects, the Lord gave guidance. Flying insects that walk on all fours were unclean, but those with jointed legs for hopping, like locusts, crickets, and grasshoppers, were permitted. Anything that touched an unclean animal became unclean until evening, and even household items, like clay pots, had to be destroyed if contaminated. These laws trained the people to distinguish between the clean and the unclean, between what was holy and what was defiled. God concluded, saying, "Be holy, because I am holy." The laws about food were not simply about health. They were a daily reminder that God's people must live differently, set apart in body and spirit. For further understanding on these laws and their application, please do not just stop here. Read the New Testament teachings also. After the laws about food and cleanliness, the Lord spoke again to Moses with instructions about purity after childbirth. The Lord said, "Speak to the Israelites and say, when a woman gives birth and bears a son, she will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days, just as during her monthly period. On the 8th day, the baby boy was to be circumcised, marking him as part of God's covenant with Abraham's descendants. Then, the mother was to continue in a time of purification for 33 more days. During this time, she was not to enter the sanctuary or touch anything sacred until her purification was complete. If she gave birth to a daughter, the period of uncleanness was longer, 2 weeks, followed by 66 days of purification. This wasn't a punishment or a sign of guilt, but a ritual separation that emphasized the holiness of life and the sacredness of childbirth. When her purification days were finished, the woman was to bring an offering to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting, a year-old lamb for a burnt offering and a young pigeon or dove for a sin offering. If she couldn't afford a lamb, she could bring 2 doves or 2 pigeons instead, one for the burnt offering and one for the sin offering. The priest would then make atonement for her, and she would be declared clean. This law was the same law Mary, the mother of Jesus, obeyed after giving birth, as documented in the Book of Luke chapter 2 verse 22 to 24. It shows how even in the earliest laws, God made a way for everyone, rich or poor, to come before him in purity and grace. After the ordination of Aaron and his sons, God continued to give Moses and Aaron detailed laws to help the Israelites live in holiness. Among these were the laws concerning leprosy and other skin diseases, found in Leviticus chapters 13 and 14. These chapters may seem technical, but they reveal how deeply God cared about the physical, spiritual, and communal well-being of his people. In those days, disease and impurity were not just physical concerns, they were spiritual matters that could separate a person from the community and from God's presence. In Leviticus chapter 13, the Lord instructed Moses and Aaron on how to identify different types of skin infections. When anyone developed a swelling, rash, or bright spot on their skin, they were to be examined by a priest, not a physician. The priest's role was to determine whether the condition was clean or unclean, because the Israelites saw disease as a sign of impurity that affected both body and soul. If the sore appeared deeper than the skin and the hair on it had turned white, it was a clear sign of leprosy, and the person was declared unclean. However, if the sore was only on the surface, the priest would isolate the person for 7 days to see whether it spread. After a second examination, if the condition had not worsened, the person was declared clean and could rejoin the community. This chapter goes into great detail about various conditions such as boils, burns, rashes, and bald spots, and how to distinguish between a temporary irritation and true leprosy. If a person was found to have leprosy, they had to live outside the camp to avoid spreading impurity. They tore their clothes, left their hair unkempt, and covered the lower part of their face while crying out, "Unclean! Unclean!" This was both a public warning and a humbling acknowledgement of their separation. Though it sounds harsh, it was a necessary step to protect the health and holiness of the entire community. The same laws applied to mildew or mold found in garments. If the infection spread after examination, the fabric was considered unclean and had to be burned. Leviticus chapter 14 shifts the focus from impurity to restoration. It outlines how someone healed from leprosy could be cleansed and restored to community life. When a person recovered, they were brought to the priest, who would perform a special purification ceremony. 2 live clean birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop were used. 1 bird was killed over running water in a clay pot, while the other was dipped into the mixture of blood and water along with the cedar wood and hyssop. The priest would sprinkle the blood 7 times on the person being cleansed and then release the live bird into the open fields, a vivid symbol of freedom, renewal, and the life restored. Afterward, the person washed their clothes, shaved all their hair, and bathed in water. They could return to the camp, but had to stay outside their tent for 7 more days. On the 7th day, they repeated the washing and shaving, and only then were they fully declared clean. On the 8th day, they brought offerings to the Lord, 2 male lambs and 1 ewe lamb, along with grain and oil. The priest took some of the blood from the guilt offering and placed it on the person's right ear, right thumb, and right big toe. Then he anointed the same spots with oil, symbolizing that the person's hearing, actions, and walk were now purified before God. This ceremony beautifully represented both physical healing and spiritual renewal, a full restoration to life, worship, and fellowship. Chapter 14 also addresses how to deal with mold or disease in a house. If a home showed signs of decay or infection, the owner was to report it to the priest. The priest would inspect the house and isolate it for 7 days. If the infection spread, the affected stones were removed and thrown outside the city. The walls were scraped clean and replastered, and if the infection did not return, the house was declared clean. The priest then performed a similar purification ceremony using 2 birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop, showing that God's concern for purity extended not just to people but to their surroundings as well. These chapters reveal how deeply God intertwined health, holiness, and community life. The meticulous examination and cleansing rituals served practical purposes in preventing the spread of disease, but they also carried profound spiritual meaning. Leprosy, with its power to isolate and disfigure, symbolized sin's ability to separate people from God. The cleansing process, involving blood, water, and sacrifice, reflected God's mercy and his desire to restore what was broken. Ultimately, Leviticus 13 and 14 teach that purity and restoration are central to God's relationship with his people. Being declared unclean was not the end. It was the beginning of a process that could lead to renewal and acceptance again. The priests, acting as mediators, reflected God's compassion as much as his holiness. These laws remind us that God's care covers every part of our lives, our health, our homes, our community, and our connection to him. What may appear as ancient health codes were, in fact, sacred lessons about holiness, patience, and the hope of being made whole again. After the death of Aaron's two sons, Nadab and Abihu, who were struck down for offering unauthorized fire before the Lord, God spoke to Moses with a new commandment, one that revealed both his holiness and his mercy. God told Moses to warn Aaron not to enter the most holy place behind the veil whenever he pleased, or he would die, for the Lord's presence appeared in a cloud over the mercy seat, the sacred cover of the Ark of the Covenant. Access to this holy space had to follow precise instructions. It was not a casual act, but a divine appointment. To approach God, Aaron first had to prepare himself with humility and purity. He was to bathe his body with water and dress in simple, sacred linen garments, the linen tunic, undergarments, sash, and turban, instead of his jeweled ephod and breastplate. The simplicity symbolized holiness and separation from human pride. Aaron would bring a young bull as a sin offering for himself and his household, and 2 male goats for the entire community of Israel. One goat would be for the Lord, and the other, the scapegoat, would symbolically carry away the sins of the people into the wilderness. After offering the bull for his own sin, Aaron was to take burning coals from the altar and 2 handfuls of finely ground incense and carry them behind the veil. Inside the most holy place, he was to pour the incense on the fire before the Lord, so that the smoke would cover the mercy seat, protecting him from death as he stood before God's presence. Then, Aaron would sprinkle the bull's blood with his finger on the front of the mercy seat and before it 7 times, making atonement for himself and his household. Afterward, he would sacrifice the goat chosen for the Lord as a sin offering for the people, bringing its blood into the most holy place to cleanse it from the impurities and transgressions of Israel. After purifying the sanctuary, Aaron would lay both hands on the head of the second goat, the scapegoat, and confess over it all the sins, wrongdoings, and transgressions of the Israelites. The goat symbolically carried the nation's guilt. The scapegoat was then sent away into the wilderness, led by a man appointed for the task, never to return. This act represented God's mercy, the complete removal of sin and shame from his people. Once the scapegoat was sent away, Aaron would remove his linen garments, bathe again in water, and put on his regular priestly clothes. He would then offer the burnt offerings for himself and for the people, completing the atonement ritual. The remains of the bull and goat used for sin offerings were to be taken outside the camp and burned completely, a symbol that sin must be removed from among the people. This entire ceremony was to be observed once a year, on the 10th day of the 7th month, known as Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. On that day, the Israelites were to humble themselves, rest from all work, and seek forgiveness and renewal. Through this sacred ritual, God provided a way for his people to be cleansed from all their sins, a reminder that holiness was not only about ritual purity, but about a renewed relationship with the Creator. Leviticus 16 is one of the most profound chapters in the Torah because it reveals God's balance between justice and mercy. The atonement rituals emphasized that sin separates humanity from God, but also that God, in his mercy, provides a way back through cleansing, humility, and faith. The priests' actions were not mere ceremony. They represented the deep truth that holiness required both purification and compassion. The people's physical cleansing mirrored their spiritual renewal, and the scapegoat symbolized complete forgiveness, the freedom to begin anew. Today, the Day of Atonement remains one of the holiest observances in Jewish faith, reminding us that forgiveness, humility, and cleansing, both inward and outward, are central to walking in holiness before After giving Aaron and his sons detailed laws for worship and atonement, God continued to speak to Moses, giving instructions that would protect the holiness of Israel's worship and the sanctity of life itself. These commands were to be passed on to Aaron, his sons, and all the Israelites so that everyone understood that worship was sacred and not to be done carelessly or outside God's appointed way. God commanded that anyone who killed a bull, lamb, or goat, whether in the camp or outside it, had to bring the animal to the entrance of the tent of meeting as an offering to the Lord. This was to prevent the people from sacrificing to idols or goat demons, as some had done in the wilderness. Every offering, even for food, was meant to remind the Israelites that life belonged to God and could not be taken lightly. This law ensured that worship stayed centralized, only through the priests, and only at the tabernacle, keeping the people united in their devotion to God and preventing the corruption of pagan practices that surrounded them. God also gave a command that became one of the most sacred principles in Scripture. For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. This statement revealed that blood represented life, and life came from God alone. Therefore, no one was allowed to eat or drink blood. Anyone who did so would be cut off from the community because they were treating something sacred, life itself, as common. Even when an Israelite or a foreigner hunted wild animals or birds for food, they had to drain out the blood and cover it with earth. This act was both symbolic and respectful, an acknowledgement that life had been taken and that it ultimately belonged to God. The chapter closes with a strong reminder: anyone who ate something that had died naturally or had been torn by wild animals would be ceremonially unclean until they washed their clothes, bathed, and waited until evening. The message was clear. God wanted his people to live in a state of awareness, reverence, and gratitude for the sacred gift of life. Leviticus 17 teaches that holiness was not just about rituals, it was about respecting life, honoring God as the source of it, and understanding that every sacrifice pointed to atonement. The restoration of the relationship between humanity and the divine. And serious chapters in the Old Testament, where God sets clear boundaries for how his people are to live, especially regarding moral and sexual conduct. The chapter begins with God speaking to Moses, commanding him to relay his words to the Israelites. God reminds them that they are not to follow the customs or behaviors of the nations around them. Specifically, they must not imitate the practices of Egypt, where they came from, nor Canaan, where they are going. Both nations were known for corrupt and immoral acts that violated God's natural order. Instead, God calls Israel to live by his laws and commandments. He tells them plainly, "You must obey my ordinances and statutes. If anyone does them, they shall live by them." This verse forms the moral foundation of the entire chapter. It's not just about restriction, but about life, purity, and relationship with God. From verse 6 onward, God lists the specific sexual relationships that are forbidden. These laws protect the sanctity of the family and the dignity of individuals. God forbids sexual relations with close relatives, including one's mother, father's wife, sister, whether full or half-sister, granddaughter, aunt, daughter-in-law, sister-in-law, or step-sibling. The message is clear: family bonds are sacred and must never be corrupted by sexual sin. He also forbids relationships with both a woman and her daughter or granddaughter, and warns against marrying two sisters at the same time, which would create jealousy and strife. These boundaries ensure that love, respect, and order remain within families. The laws then move beyond family relationships to other moral commands. God forbids adultery, having sexual relations with another man's wife, as a violation of trust and covenant. He further prohibits the ancient pagan practice of offering one's children to Molech, a false god associated with child sacrifice. This horrific act is condemned as both idolatry and bloodshed, desecrating the name of God. Leviticus 18 verse 22 explicitly forbids same-sex relations between men, calling it detestable in the sight of God, and verse 23 prohibits sexual relations with animals, labeling it perverse and unnatural. Together, these commands define the moral boundaries God set for human sexuality, designed for life, love, and covenant, not for lust or exploitation. The closing verses of the chapter carry a solemn warning. God explains that the very land of Canaan became defiled because of such practices, and that's why the nations living there were driven out. If Israel commits the same sins, the land will vomit them out as it did their predecessors. This strong image underlines that immorality not only defiles individuals, but pollutes entire communities. God's message concludes with a call to holiness and separation. The Israelites are told to keep His decrees and not to engage in the detestable practices of the surrounding nations. Obedience would keep them in covenant relationship with God. Disobedience would bring judgment. In essence, Leviticus 18 isn't just a list of prohibitions, it's a moral map for a holy people. It shows that God cares deeply about purity, family structure, and how people treat one another. The laws were meant to preserve dignity, protect relationships, and reflect God's own holiness among His chosen nation. Leviticus 18 teaches that holiness isn't only about worship or sacrifice, it's about everyday choices, personal boundaries, and honoring God through moral living. It reminds believers that purity and obedience bring life, while sin and corruption lead to destruction. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Tell the people of Israel, be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Respect your mother and father. Keep my Sabbaths, for I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols or make metal gods, I alone am your God. When you bring peace offerings, do it the right way, and eat them while they are fresh. Do not profane what is holy to me. When you harvest your fields, don't reap to the very edges. Leave some for the poor and the foreigner. When you pick grapes, don't gather every last one, leave some behind. This is how you show mercy. Do not steal, do not lie, and do not deceive one another. Do not swear falsely by my name, for that dishonors me. Do not cheat your neighbor or rob him. Pay your workers on time. Don't let their wages stay with you overnight. Do not curse the deaf or put an obstacle before the blind. Show reverence, for I am the Lord. Judge everyone fairly. Don't favor the poor or the powerful. Treat all people with justice. Do not spread gossip or endanger another's life. Do not hate your brother in your heart. Confront wrongs honestly, but do not seek revenge or hold grudges. Instead, love your neighbor as yourself, for I am the Lord. Do not mix different kinds of animals, seeds, or fabrics. This is a symbol of purity and order in your lives. If a man sins with a servant woman, he must bring a guilt offering to the Lord, and forgiveness will be made. When you plant trees, treat the fruit as forbidden for the first 3 years. In the 4th year, give the fruit as an offering to the Lord. In the 5th year, you may eat it, then the tree will yield abundantly. Do not eat meat with blood still in it. Do not use divination or witchcraft. Do not cut your bodies or make tattoos for the dead. I am the Lord. Do not dishonor your daughters by making them prostitutes, or the land will become filled with wickedness. Keep my Sabbaths holy, and do not turn to mediums or spiritists, for they defile you. Stand up in the presence of the elderly, show respect for your elders, and honor your God. Do not mistreat foreigners who live among you. Love them as yourself, because you were foreigners in Egypt. Use honest scales, honest weights, and fair measures. Be truthful in business, for I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Keep all my statutes and all my judgments, and live by them. I am the Lord your God. In Leviticus chapter 20, God commands severe judgment against sins such as child sacrifice, witchcraft, sexual immorality, and defiling family relationships, warning Israel to remain holy and separate from the nations that practice such evils. He reminds them that holiness requires discipline, obedience, and reverence for his laws, for he is the Lord who sanctifies his people. The Lord then spoke to Moses, giving instructions for the priests, those chosen to serve before him. They were to live set apart, avoiding defilement from the dead and keeping their conduct pure. A priest was not to shave his head or cut his flesh in mourning, nor marry a woman defiled by prostitution or divorce, for they were holy to their God. The high priest, who bore the anointing oil, was held to an even higher standard. He could not uncover his head or leave the sanctuary when mourning, for he carried the holiness of God before the people. His marriage was to be to a virgin from among his own people, to preserve the sacredness of his priestly line. God declared that any descendant of Aaron with physical defects, blindness, lameness, or deformity could not offer sacrifices at the altar, though they could still partake of the holy food. This distinction was not punishment, but a reflection of divine order, teaching Israel that what stands before the Lord must be whole and consecrated. Thus, the priests were called to live as examples of purity, reverence, and obedience, showing through their lives what it meant to be holy unto the Lord. The Lord spoke to Moses, commanding the priests to honor his holiness when handling sacred offerings. They were warned not to defile the holy things brought by the Israelites and to maintain ceremonial purity before approaching the altar. Only those who were clean could eat of the holy food, no outsider, servant, or stranger. God also reminded Israel that sacrifices offered to him must be without blemish, no blind, injured, or deformed animal could be accepted. Offerings were to be given with sincerity and perfection, for he is the Lord who sanctifies them. These laws reinforce the sacredness of worship and the need for respect in approaching God's presence. God outlined his appointed feasts, holy days that marked the rhythm of worship and remembrance for his people. The Sabbath was to be a day of rest and assembly. The Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread reminded Israel of their deliverance from Egypt. The Feast of First Fruits celebrated the beginning of harvest, and the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, gave thanks for abundance. In the 7th month came the Feast of Trumpets, calling for reflection and renewal, followed by the Day of Atonement, a solemn day of repentance. Finally, the Feast of Tabernacles celebrated God's presence and provision in the wilderness. These sacred days bound Israel to their God, reminding them that time itself belonged to him, every season, every harvest, every moment of rest. The Lord instructed Moses about the continual burning of pure olive oil in the lamps of the sanctuary, a symbol of God's eternal light among his people. The showbread, 12 loaves placed weekly before the Lord, represented his covenant with the 12 tribes of Israel. Then came a solemn warning. A man who blasphemed the name of God was brought before Moses, and by God's command, he was put to death. This law emphasized reverence for God's holy name. The chapter concluded with principles of justice, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, showing God's fairness and accountability among his people. These instructions remind us that holiness, gratitude, and justice are the foundations of life with God. The pure offerings symbolized integrity of heart, the feasts taught remembrance and thanksgiving, and the laws of justice and reverence upheld the sanctity of community life. Through them all, God was teaching Israel and us that worship is not a ritual, but a relationship built on respect, holiness, and gratitude to the one who sanctifies his people. The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, giving instructions about rest and restoration for the land and the people. Every 7th year was to be a Sabbath year, when the land itself rested, no planting, pruning, or harvesting. What grew naturally was for everyone, servants, foreigners, and even animals. This law reminded Israel that the land belonged to God and that provision came from his hand. After 7 cycles of 7 years, the year of Jubilee was declared, the 50th year of freedom. In that year, debts were forgiven, slaves were released, and land was returned to its original family. It was a year of mercy and renewal, restoring balance and justice among the people. God reminded them never to oppress one another, for they were all his servants, redeemed from slavery in Egypt. He promised blessing and abundance if they trusted him enough to let the land rest and live according to his statutes. God then laid out blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. If Israel walked in his ways, he would send rain in season, bless their harvests, and give them peace in the land. Their enemies would fall before them, and his presence would dwell among them. I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people. But if they rebelled, he warned of famine, disease, and exile. Their pride would bring desolation, and their cities would lie in ruins. Yet, even in judgment, God promised mercy. If they confessed their sins and humbled their hearts, he would remember his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and restore them once again. God gave laws about vows and dedications. Anyone who made a special vow, dedicating a person, animal, or possession to the Lord, was to do so with sincerity and truth. The value of what was offered depended on age, strength, or worth, but each vow symbolized gratitude and devotion to God. The chapter also covered tithes, a tenth of all crops and herds belonging to the Lord. These offerings supported the priesthood and reminded Israel that everything they owned came from his blessing. The Book of Leviticus concludes with themes of restoration, accountability, and covenant faithfulness. The Sabbath year and Jubilee year taught that true freedom and prosperity come from trusting God's rhythm, not human effort. The blessings and warnings reminded Israel that obedience leads to peace and abundance, while rebellion leads to loss. The final laws on vows and tithes emphasized gratitude, faithfulness, and the importance of honoring God with what we have. These closing chapters reveal that God's laws were not about control. They were about compassion, justice, and renewal, drawing his people back to a life centered on holiness and trust.
Did you enjoy the story? Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. This motivates us to create more Bible-inspired stories to share with you. God bless you.